You are already seated in the room before you realize you have arrived. The air carries the faint scent of old wood and extinguished candles, a dryness that settles in the throat, not unpleasant, simply precise. Light enters from a high window you cannot quite see, falling not as a beam, but as a quiet presence, enough to reveal faces without illuminating corners. I speak to you from this half-light because what must be said does not survive full exposure. It belongs to the layer of the psyche that withdraws when named too quickly. You have come here because something in you has stopped moving outward. Not dramatically. There was no announcement, no rupture that others could point to. The change you are living through did not begin with anger or resolve. It began with fatigue, a particular fatigue that no amount of sleep touches, the fatigue of explanation. For years you believed that if you could only make yourself understood, the tension would dissolve, the misattunement would soften, the strange hostility that followed your presence would finally lose its justification. You learned to translate yourself into smaller units, more acceptable shapes, careful tones. You learned to preempt misunderstanding by offering context, motive, reassurance. You became fluent in the emotional language of others while quietly losing your own. This, I warn you, was never neutral. Every explanation you offered was not merely information. It was a psychic concession, a yielding of inner authority. When you explain yourself to someone who is not truly listening, you are not clarifying reality. You are fragmenting it. And when this pattern repeats over years, something deep within you begins to organize itself around defense rather than expression. The empath, contrary to popular imagination, is not defined by sensitivity alone, but by an early necessity to read the room in order to survive it. Your gift was born from adaptation. Your warmth was forged in a climate where warmth was required to stabilize others. Look carefully at the word empath, and you will find within it not only empathy, but exposure, a permeable boundary. You learned to remain open because closing was dangerous. You learned to explain because silence once carried consequences you could not afford. But the psyche does not forget its origins, and it does not forgive imbalance indefinitely. There comes a point, always, where compensation begins. The unconscious prepares its counter-movement long before the ego admits exhaustion. When you stop explaining, something awakens, not outside you, but beneath. It is not rage. That would be too simple, too visible. It is a colder force, and therefore more frightening to those who once relied on your openness. It is the return of psychic gravity, the reappearance of weight. People begin to feel it before they can name it. They sense that access has changed, not because you have erected walls, but because you are no longer leaning forward to meet them halfway. You remain where you are, and that stillness is interpreted as threat. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They believe withdrawal is an act, a strategy, a reaction. In truth, what you are living through is not withdrawal at all. It is the cessation of overextension. When a muscle stops compensating, it appears inactive only to those who benefited from the strain. Your silence is not emptiness, it is density. It is the psyche folding back into its center of gravity, reclaiming mass it once dispersed in order to be palatable. I must speak carefully here, because the danger is subtle. The danger is not that you will become cold. The danger is that you will misinterpret what is awakening and attempt to suppress it out of habit. You have been trained to mistrust your own firmness. You associate it with harm, but firmness is not cruelty. It is structure, and the psyche, like the body, collapses without structure. There is a scene that returns often in dreams of those like you. Perhaps you have known it, a corridor, long and dim, with doors on either side. You walk it repeatedly, knocking, opening, explaining yourself to empty rooms. Your voice echoes back thinner each time, until eventually you stop speaking. When that happens in the dream, something changes. The corridor does not respond with silence. It responds with sound you had not noticed before. The hum of the building, the weight of your own footsteps, the realization that the corridor was never meant to be traversed endlessly. It was meant to be exited. The psyche speaks in images because images bypass negotiation. When you stop explaining in waking life, the unconscious begins to speak more directly. Intuition sharpens, not as anxiety, but as certainty. You find yourself less inclined to justify decisions internally. The inner committee that once debated every choice begins to dissolve. This is not because you have become impulsive. It is because the self has begun to assert itself over the ego's diplomatic compulsions. The self does not explain, it reveals, and revelation, to those invested in your former transparency, feels like concealment. They will say you have changed. They will say you are distant. They may accuse you of arrogance, of secrecy, of emotional withdrawal. These accusations are not diagnostic. They are protests. Protests against the loss of unconscious privilege. When you explained yourself, you allowed others to orient around you without orienting toward themselves. You carried the burden of clarity for the entire relational field. Consider a simple moment from daily life. You are standing in a kitchen late at night. The light above the sink flickers slightly. There is the smell of metal and water, the faint sound of traffic beyond the window. Someone asks you a familiar question, one that has always required a careful answer, a softening preface, a reassurance that their feelings will be protected. This time, you feel no impulse to perform that ritual, not because you wish to wound, but because the words do not come. In their place is a stillness in the chest, a quiet knowing that whatever you say will be interpreted through old lenses anyway. You answer simply, or you do not answer at all. The room feels colder, not in temperature, but in tone. The other person shifts. You feel it immediately, but you do not rush to repair it. This is the threshold. At this point, the psyche presents you with an internal dialogue. You may recognize a voice rises and says, quietly but insistently, "You are being unkind." Another responds, just as quietly, "No, I am being exact." This conversation does not escalate. It does not resolve. It simply exists, and in its existence, something ancient realigns. You begin to differentiate guilt from responsibility. Guilt is a social emotion. Responsibility is an ontological one. You are responsible for your inner truth. You are not responsible for the discomfort that arises when others can no longer feed on your explanations. Here lies the final warning. If you retreat from this moment, If you resume explaining to relieve the tension, you will teach your psyche that its awakening was dangerous. You will reinforce the old hierarchy where others' comfort supersedes your coherence. The unconscious will not forget this betrayal easily. Symptoms will return in subtler forms: fatigue without cause, a sense of unreality, the feeling of living slightly to the left of your own life. But if you tolerate the unease without translating it into apology, something irreversible begins. The shadow reorganizes. Parts of you that were split off in the service of being understood begin to reintegrate. Anger returns, not as explosion, but as boundary. Desire returns, not as craving, but as direction. Even compassion changes. It becomes less reflexive, more discerning. You no longer offer yourself as a solution. You offer presence, and only where presence is met. I do not romanticize this process. There will be loss. Relationships built on your availability to explain will not survive your silence. This does not mean they were false. It means they were contingent. The psyche does not judge this. It simply notes the cost. And in noting the cost, it recalibrates value. Listen to the room again. The light has not changed, but your eyes have adjusted. You notice the grain in the wood, the way shadows gather where walls meet. This is how the unconscious works. It does not flood you with new content. It sharpens perception. When you stop explaining, you stop scattering attention. It gathers, and gathered attention is power, though not the kind that dominates. It is the power to remain intact in the presence of misunderstanding. This is what awakens, not superiority, not detachment, integrity. And integrity, once established, cannot be negotiated away without consequence. You will feel this in small ways at first. A refusal that does not require rehearsal, a silence that does not demand justification, a sense that your inner life no longer needs an audience to be real. I speak to you now from this stillness because it is the last place the empath expects to find authority. You were taught that authority belonged to those who spoke loudest, explained most convincingly, controlled the narrative, but the deepest authority is pre-verbal. It resides in the self, which does not argue for its existence. It simply is. Stay here long enough, and you will notice that even your thoughts slow. The compulsion to anticipate reactions weakens. You begin to experience time differently, not as urgency, but as depth. And with that depth comes a new ethical question, one you have not had to face before, because it was always postponed by explanation. The question is not how do I make this understandable? It is how do I remain true without becoming hard? There is no answer you can carry forward from this room. Answers belong to the ego. What you carry instead is orientation, a felt sense of center, and as you move from this space back into your life, you will discover that some conversations no longer begin. Some conflicts dissolve before forming. Others intensify briefly, then burn out. Through all of this, the warning remains active, not as threat, but as gravity. Do not explain yourself back into fragmentation. Do not apologize for coherence. What awakens when you stop explaining is not something you can put back to sleep without cost. It is the self, finally, no longer drowned out by your own generosity. beginning to speak in a language that does not require permission. And as you listen to it, as you allow its presence to settle without translation, you may notice that the room itself seems to lean inward, as if the walls were listening too. And in that listening, there is a pause, not an ending, but a suspension, a moment where the psyche gathers itself before moving deeper, before turning toward a layer that until now has remained untouched, waiting for the one condition it requires above all others, which is your willingness to remain silent long enough for something older than explanation to continue unfolding, not as a declaration but as a pressure, a quiet insistence that does not push yet does not retreat. This is the quality you must learn to recognize, because it is unfamiliar to those who have lived by responsiveness. It is not urgency, it is not demand, it is the slow turning of something subterranean that has waited through years of accommodation, learning the weight of the earth above it, learning patience the way roots learn patience. You may notice in the days that follow this shift that people begin to speak differently around you. Their sentences trail off, their jokes land awkwardly, they ask questions that are not really questions, invitations disguised as curiosity. They are searching for the old access point, and when it does not open, they experience a peculiar disorientation. You feel it in their eyes before they articulate it, a flicker of irritation, then confusion, then something closer to fear. Not fear of you as a person, but fear of the mirror you have ceased to hold up for them. For a long time, your explanations functioned as a buffer between their unconscious material and their awareness. You named emotions before they had to. You softened truths before they could cut. You metabolized tension so others could remain comfortable in their self-image. When this stops, their psyche is forced into direct contact with its own contents. This is rarely welcomed. Thus, the accusation shifts. You are told you have become hard to read. This is spoken as criticism, but it is a confession. What they mean is that they can no longer locate themselves through you. Here the shadow enters decisively. Not yours alone, but the collective shadow that gathers wherever someone refuses to perform their assigned role. The shadow hates vacuums. It rushes to fill the space left by your silence with projection. You are cold. You are distant. You are withholding. None of these statements describe you. They describe the discomfort of those encountering their own unprocessed dependency. If you respond to these projections by explaining yourself, you re-enter the old circuit. If you do not, the projection must collapse back onto its source. This collapse can be violent in its own quiet way. There may be a sudden confrontation, a long message, an emotional appeal wrapped in moral language. You will be tempted to answer it thoroughly, compassionately, clearly. You will feel the old muscle twitch. This is the precise moment of danger, not because responding is wrong in itself, but because responding from reflex reinstates the hierarchy that placed your clarity beneath others' regulation. Pause instead and attend to your body. Notice how your breathing has changed since you stopped explaining. It is lower now, deeper. There is a weight in the abdomen that was not there before. This is not anxiety. Anxiety floats upward. This settles downward. It anchors. The psyche is re-inhabiting regions it abandoned early in life. regions associated with instinct, with grounded refusal, with a simple right to occupy space without justification. You may remember a childhood scene that until now felt insignificant, standing in a doorway while adults spoke over you, wanting to say something, knowing it would be misunderstood, deciding not to, or saying it anyway, and watching it dissolve into laughter or dismissal. These moments are stored not as narratives but as postures. The posture of leaning forward, the posture of softening, the posture of making yourself legible at your own expense. When you stop explaining, these postures release, the body straightens, the shoulders settle back, not in defiance, but in return. There is often grief here. Though it does not announce itself as such, it arrives as a thin sadness at unexpected times, while washing dishes, while walking past a window at dusk. You realize how long you have lived as an interpreter rather than a participant. How much of your life energy went into maintaining bridges no one else crossed. This grief is not self-pity, it is recognition. And recognition is the beginning of mourning. You are mourning not only what was taken from you, but what you willingly gave before you had the capacity to refuse. The ego resists this mourning by seeking meaning too quickly. It wants to frame the experience as growth, empowerment, awakening. These words are not false, but they are premature. The psyche requires a period of silence after a long illness, not celebration. If you rush to narrate your transformation, you turn it back into explanation. Let the change remain unnamed. Let it work in the dark. Dreams often intensify during this phase. You may dream of animals watching you from a distance, wolves, cats, birds perched just out of reach. They do not approach. They do not flee. They observe. These are not omens. They are indicators of instinct returning to proximity. Instinct does not speak in sentences. It communicates through stance, through gaze, through timing. The empath, having lived so long in the realm of emotional language, must relearn this grammar. There is a sensory quality to this relearning. Sounds become sharper. You notice the pause between words in conversation more than the words themselves. You smell rain before it falls. Light at certain hours feels heavier, more textured. These perceptions are not mystical embellishments. They are signs that attention has withdrawn from constant social scanning and returned to the environment. The nervous system is no longer solely oriented toward others. It is redistributing its resources. At this stage, many make a subtle mistake. They believe that because they are no longer explaining, they must also withdraw from relationship entirely. This is an overcorrection. Silence is not isolation. It is selectivity. The psyche does not want fewer connections. It wants truer ones. When you stop explaining, you begin to notice who can remain present without being reassured, who can tolerate not knowing exactly where they stand, who does not require your inner life to be translated into terms they can control. These people are rare. They may have always been present at the periphery of your life, or they may enter now, drawn by a quality they cannot articulate. They will not ask you to define yourself. They will respond to you as you are. This is how the self recognizes kinship, not through similarity, but through resonance. There is another internal dialogue that emerges here, quieter than the first. It says, if I do not explain, I may be misunderstood forever, and another voice answers, yes, and then nothing follows. This is not resignation. It is acceptance of a fundamental truth the empath has long resisted. Being understood by everyone is not only impossible, it is incompatible with individuation. To become oneself is to accept misrecognition as the cost of coherence. This acceptance does not harden you, it simplifies you. You speak less, but when you do, words carry weight. You choose actions over clarifications. You let consequences speak. There is a moral maturity in this that does not seek applause. It is closer to nature than to ethics. Rivers do not explain why they flood. They move according to laws deeper than opinion. You may feel moments of loneliness sharper than before. This is because the constant hum of relational maintenance has gone quiet, revealing spaces you once filled with effort. Do not rush to fill them again. Loneliness here is not abandonment. It is room for parts of you that were never allowed to develop because they did not serve the role of emotional mediator. Curiosity returns, playfulness, perhaps awkward at first, even boredom, which is a sign that the psyche is no longer overstimulated by vigilance. In this room, as I speak, the silence between my words is doing as much work as the words themselves. You can hear the faint settling of the building, the distant sound of wind against stone. This is not atmosphere for effect. It mirrors the internal condition I am describing. When explanation ceases, the psyche becomes audible to itself. And what it hears at first is not revelation, but structure, beams, foundations, the slow creak of something long held under strain being allowed to rest. The warning remains implicit, not because it needs to be repeated, but because it is now lived rather than stated. If you attempt to explain this phase to those who demand the old you, you will fracture it. If you attempt to weaponize your silence, you will distort it. The self does not tolerate being used as defense. It requires humility as much as firmness. What awakens when you stop explaining is not a persona to be displayed. It is an internal order that asks you to live from it without announcing it. This is more difficult than performance. It offers no immediate reward, but it is stable, and stability, once established, exerts a quiet influence on everything it touches. Stay with this influence as it deepens. There is another layer ahead, one that involves not only how you relate to others, but how you relate to meaning itself. As the psyche continues its inward rotation, it will bring you into contact with an older question, one that has been deferred by years of translation and mediation. A question about what you are willing to serve when no one is asking you to explain. A question that does not arrive as language, but as a pressure in the chest and a narrowing of choices. And as this pressure gathers, as it begins to shape your days and nights without asking permission, you may sense that the real work has only just begun. That what has awakened is not merely a boundary, but a center, and that this center, once felt, will begin to reorganize your life from within, drawing certain paths closer and letting others fall away, not with drama, but with inevitability, like a tide turning long before the shoreline notices, moving steadily toward a depth you have not yet entered but are already approaching, not as a destination, but as a compression. A narrowing of possibility that feels at first like loss and later reveals itself as direction. When the center awakens, it does not expand your options, it reduces them. This is how meaning differentiates itself from distraction. You may feel this as a strange intolerance for certain conversations, certain environments, certain rhythms of life that once felt merely tiring and now feel untenable. The psyche is no longer willing to dissipate itself. It has tasted density, and it will not return easily to diffusion. You begin to notice how often your past choices were guided not by desire, but by avoidance of tension. How many paths you took because they required explanation rather than conviction. The empath learns early that conviction invites confrontation, while explanation invites negotiation. Negotiation felt safer. It kept relationships intact, even if it slowly eroded the self. Now, the calculus has changed. What once felt safe feels corrosive. What once felt risky feels necessary. This reorientation does not announce itself as clarity. It arrives as refusal, a refusal to engage in certain dynamics without quite knowing why. You decline invitations you cannot justify logically. You step away from projects that look admirable from the outside. The ego panics here. It demands reasons. It fears regression, isolation, selfishness, but beneath the panic is a quieter recognition. You are no longer willing to live divided. Division was the hidden cost of explanation. Each time you translated yourself, you split experience into what you felt and what could be said. Over time, the unsayable accumulated like sediment. Anger, you softened. Intuition, you doubted. Knowing, you deferred. When you stop explaining, these fragments begin to rejoin, not smoothly. Integration is messy. It disrupts the internal order that once kept you functional at the expense of coherence. There may be moments when you feel strangely blunt, even to yourself. Thoughts arise without cushioning. Desires present themselves without moral framing. This can feel alarming, especially if you have identified goodness with gentleness, but gentleness without truth is compliance. What is emerging now is not cruelty, but alignment. Alignment feels sharp at first because it cuts through habits built on self-abandonment. Consider another ordinary scene. You are sitting across from someone who has known you for years. They recount a familiar grievance, expecting the usual nods, the usual careful validation. You listen, but something has shifted. You hear not only their words, but the pattern beneath them, the repetition, the way the story secures their identity. You realize that any response you offer will either reinforce the pattern or disrupt it. And for the first time, you do not feel responsible for managing the outcome. You speak a simple truth, or you remain silent. The air thickens. You feel the tension in your jaw, the weight behind your eyes, but you do not retreat. Afterward, you may feel a wave of doubt. Was that necessary? Was that kind? This is the ego attempting to reassert its former role as mediator. Let the doubt pass without feeding it. Doubt here is not a signal of error. It is residue. The psyche is shedding an old skin, and it itches. As this continues, you will encounter a deeper loneliness than before, but also a deeper companionship. The loneliness comes from no longer being mirrored constantly. The companionship comes from being accompanied by yourself. This may sound abstract, but it is profoundly concrete. You trust your perceptions more. You take your own fatigue seriously. You stop overriding your limits in the name of harmony. Harmony that requires self-erasure is not harmony. It is anesthesia. The shadow, now less projected outward, begins to reveal its positive content. Strength you once associated with domination shows itself as steadiness. Anger reveals its capacity to protect. Even indifference, long feared, reveals itself not as coldness, but as discernment. You do not feel less, you feel less compelled. This distinction is crucial. Compulsion masquerades as care. When it lifts, care becomes choice. There is a temptation at this stage to identify yourself with this new firmness, to form a counter-persona, the one who no longer explains, the one who withholds. Resist this. Every persona, even one built on withdrawal, is still a mask. The self is not defined by what it refuses, but by what it serves. And service here does not mean sacrifice. It means orientation toward what gives life depth rather than breadth. You may notice that questions of meaning surface more insistently now, not philosophical abstractions, but practical inquiries. What is worth my time? What relationships nourish rather than drain? What work allows me to remain intact? These questions are not answered once. They are lived, and living them requires tolerating periods of ambiguity without rushing to resolve them through explanation. Sleep may change. You wake earlier or later. Dreams become less symbolic and more direct, sometimes almost banal. Conversations with figures who speak plainly, landscapes without ornament. This is the unconscious simplifying itself as it aligns with conscious life. Excess imagery falls away. What remains is function. In the quiet moments, perhaps early morning or late evening, you may feel a subtle gratitude that surprises you. Not gratitude toward anyone in particular, but toward the fact of being, toward the sensation of standing in your own life without narrating it. This gratitude is not exuberant, it is sober, it carries weight, it asks nothing in return. I must say this clearly, because it is often misunderstood. This process does not make you immune to pain. In some ways, it makes pain sharper, because you no longer dilute it with explanation. But it also makes pain meaningful. Pain becomes information rather than indictment. You listen to it, you respond, you do not dramatize it. The final illusion to dissolve here is the belief that explanation is synonymous with connection. True connection does not require constant clarification. It requires presence, mutual recognition, and the willingness to remain when certainty is unavailable. Many cannot do this. That is not your failure. It is a limit you are no longer obligated to compensate for. As you sit with this, as days and weeks unfold under this new internal order, you may sense something else shifting quietly in the background, a relationship to authority, to guidance, to what you once sought in others. The need for external validation weakens, not because you disdain it, but because it no longer regulates your worth. You are guided more by an internal compass whose directions are felt rather than argued. This is where the deeper work waits, beyond boundaries, beyond silence, beyond the relief of no longer explaining. There is a confrontation with purpose that cannot be deferred much longer. When the empath stops explaining, they eventually stop asking permission. And when permission is no longer sought, a question arises that has nothing to do with others' expectations and everything to do with your own alignment with the self's intent. A question that presses closer now, shaping your attention, reorganizing your days, asking not who you are to others, but what you are called toward when no one is watching, when no one is asking, when silence is no longer defensive but fertile, and in that fertility something prepares to speak again, not to justify itself, but to choose, to commit, to move. And as this readiness gathers, as it tightens into a form you can almost feel but not yet name, the psyche leans forward into a still deeper layer, one that carries consequence beyond relationship, beyond identity, into the realm of fate and vocation, where the final implications of your silence begin to take shape not as a vision, but as an inevitability that can no longer be postponed. When silence is no longer used as a shield, it becomes a listening chamber, and in that chamber, something begins to orient you toward a life that is no longer organized around reaction. This is the most disquieting development of all, because reaction gave you a sense of usefulness. It placed you inside other people's stories. Orientation removes that role. It asks you to become responsible for a direction that no one else has authored. The psyche resists this at first by producing fantasies of escape. A simpler life, a quieter place, a relationship where nothing is asked of you. These fantasies are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They imagine relief without responsibility. What is forming now does not promise ease. It promises coherence, and coherence demands participation. It requires you to stand somewhere, not merely withdraw from where you no longer belong. You may feel this as a pressure to decide, even when no external deadline exists. Decisions that once felt optional now feel urgent, though the urgency is internal. Stay or go, continue or end, speak or remain silent. The empath, long accustomed to deferring choice until consensus is reached, now faces a different demand. The self does not wait for consensus. It moves when alignment is present. If you ignore this movement, a subtle dissonance develops, a sense of being out of phase with your own life. There is often a moment, deceptively small, when this becomes undeniable. You are asked to do something you have always done, offer support, smooth a conflict, explain a complexity so others can move forward without discomfort, and you feel unmistakably that doing so would betray something essential, not dramatic, not catastrophic, just wrong. The wrongness is quiet, but absolute. This is not morality speaking, it is vocation. Vocation is not a career. It is not even necessarily visible. It is the pattern of energy that emerges when the self is allowed to organize life from within. For some, it manifests as work. For others, as a way of inhabiting relationship. For many, it is simply a way of being present in the world that no longer requires self-erasure. What matters is not the form, but the fidelity to that inner order, you may notice that your relationship to time shifts again here. The future no longer feels like something to be optimized through explanation and planning. It feels weighted, consequential. Choices echo forward more clearly. This can produce anxiety, but it is a different anxiety than before. It is not the fear of being misunderstood, it is the fear of missing your own life. At this depth, the archetypal dimension becomes unavoidable. The empath who stops explaining often encounters the archetype of the hermit, not as isolation, but as authority withdrawn from the crowd, or the archetype of the judge, not as condemnation, but as discernment. These figures are not costumes to be worn. They are internal functions coming online. They give shape to instinct. They allow the psyche to say yes and no without apology. There may also be dreams of standing at thresholds, doors that open onto landscapes you do not yet enter, trains you watch depart without you. These images are not about regret, they are about timing. The unconscious is teaching patience of a different kind, not the patience of endurance, but the patience of readiness. You are no longer waiting for others to catch up. You are waiting for your own alignment to settle enough to move without fragmentation. In waking life, this patience can feel like stillness, even stagnation. Others may interpret it that way. They may urge you to act, to decide, to explain your hesitation. Do not confuse stillness with indecision. Stillness here is integration in progress. The psyche is consolidating resources before committing them. To rush, this would be to act from habit rather than truth. There is a sensory quality to this consolidation. The body feels heavier, more grounded. You enjoy fewer stimuli, but more deeply. Noise becomes tiring. Certain music no longer fits. Silence, once associated with abandonment, now feels companionable. In moments of true quiet, you may sense a subtle warmth in the chest, not excitement, but steadiness. This warmth is not given by others. It is generated internally. It is the affective signature of the self. With this comes a change in compassion. You still feel others' pain, but it no longer pulls you out of yourself. You recognize suffering without assuming responsibility for its resolution. This may feel like a loss of virtue at first. You may worry you are becoming indifferent, but indifference does not feel like this. Indifference is flat. What you are experiencing is differentiated care. Care that respects boundaries, including your own. The final temptation is to turn back and explain all of this, to articulate your transformation so others will understand and perhaps approve. Resist this, not because explanation is forbidden, but because premature articulation freezes a living process into concept. Let your life speak instead. Let your choices, your refusals, your presence communicate what words cannot without distortion. There will be those who drift away quietly, others who confront you, a few who remain, changed by your change. Accept all of this without narrative. Do not cast yourself as hero or victim. Both are defenses against humility. Humility here does not mean smallness. It means accuracy, seeing yourself as you are, neither inflated nor diminished. Accuracy brings peace of a particular kind, not contentment, not happiness, but rightness, the sense that even difficulty belongs. that even loss has context. This peace is not soothing, it is stabilizing. It allows you to stand in moments that would have once collapsed you into explanation. In this room, the light has shifted again, though perhaps you did not notice when. The shadows are longer now, the air cooler, there's a sense of evening approaching, not as an ending, but as a deepening. This mirrors the psychic movement we have followed, from outward engagement to inward consolidation, from explanation to orientation, from orientation to commitment. What remains to be said cannot be said directly, not because it is secret, but because it is lived. When you leave this room, when you return to the ordinary structures of your life, you will find that something in you has already decided certain things. You may argue with it, you may delay, but you will not be able to unfeel the center that has formed. This is the final warning. Though it does not sound like one, do not abandon this center out of fear. Do not explain it away. Do not dilute it to remain accessible. The world does not need more explanation. It needs more people who are inwardly aligned enough to act without cruelty and without apology. When the empath stops explaining, what awakens is not merely strength, but destiny in its quiet form, not a grand fate imposed from outside, but a necessity arising from within. You will recognize it not by excitement, but by the absence of inner argument, by the way your body agrees before your mind does, by the way certain paths feel heavy and others, though difficult, feel clean. As you sit here a moment longer, notice the silence again. It is not empty. It is full of presence. This is the silence you carry with you now, not as withdrawal, but as ground. And from this ground, when you speak again, if you speak, your words will not seek to be understood by everyone. They will seek to be true, and that will be enough. The room does not close behind you. It remains. You can return to it whenever you refuse the old compulsion to explain yourself into pieces. Each time you choose coherence over accommodation, you step back into this depth, and each time the center strengthens until eventually, without effort, without declaration, your life begins to move in accordance with it, quietly, irrevocably, as though it had been waiting all along for you to stop speaking long enough to hear what was already there.